Hello, and welcome to the online version of our class for today on the Archaeologies of Political Authority. So the reading I asked you guys to do for today comes from this book by Adam Smith called The Political Landscape. And I guess I would have liked to get your thoughts on this book and this chapter in particular. It can be challenging reading. There was a lot of complex language and references in this. But basically, this chapter is about the study of the state in political anthropology, and there is a lot of different scholarship that's referenced. And we will see this genre, this type of literature again, and it's something that's called a literature review. So what is a literature review? Well, a literature review is basically the history of scholarship about your topic, and it includes citations and references to all of the literature that you're um, discussing. And it's something that can be a section of a research article or scholarly essay that you're writing, but it could also be its own standalone article. So, for example, we have like a journal called the Annual Review of Anthropology, and people write review articles for this that sort of summarize all of the scholarship that's been sort of produced about a particular topic. And when you do research, in addition to collecting your own data and managing it, another thing that you often need to demonstrate is understanding of all the other work that's come before yours on the particular subject that you're researching. Now, is it fun to read or even write literature reviews? I think the responses on this are varying. I know some people who do enjoy literature reviews, but I certainly don't think so. But I think it's important to remember that even if you struggle to read things like this right now, the comprehension of this kind of literature is something that accumulates over time. So, for example, this particular chapter I've probably now read for the third or fourth time, and I think it's finally making sense to me. I finally sort of feel like I get it, and that's again an understanding that's accumulated not only as I've read this multiple times, sort of at different stages in my life, but also as I've become more familiar with the actual literature that it's referencing. So how do you put together a literature review about your subject, whether you're writing something, sort of for a shorter section of an article or something that's a standalone longer piece? The first thing you do is find all of the relevant literature about your topic, and different people have different ideas about when to begin sort of this search. Some of us go back to the origins of the actual idea, and some people begin a little bit more, I guess, in a shallowly, sort of with, more modern sort of scholarship, or they pick a certain sort of starting point. But basically, you find all of the relevant literature about your topic, and then you read it all, and you make sure you understand it, and you think about how to summarize it, and also you've got to sort of insert what you think about it, right? What you think is missing or lacking or correct or incorrect, because the whole point is you need to think about what your work is going to add to that body of scholarship. So the idea of a literature review, or sort of writing a history of research section, whether we're talking about a research paper or a proposal or a larger project, is something that's also designed to lead up to your own research ideas. So for example, in this chapter that I've asked you to read for today, Adam Smith is sort of talking about the way ancient states have been studied, and he's critiquing most of the approaches as a way of sort of leading up to his own suggestions about how to study ancient politics. And here's a hint, it's not through the concept of the state. And that essentially was what the rest of this book is about, his sort of understanding of politics in this particular way. So what's the deal with the idea of the state, particularly in archaeology? So there's two problems, and we've sort of talked about these earlier. We talked about why it's difficult to understand politics in archaeology. And the first is that it's difficult to understand ancient politics without projecting modern day entities and sort of understandings into the past. So we have all these assumptions about political organization and the structure of governments that are sort of based on our own lived experience. And sometimes it's difficult for us to think outside of that framework to conceive of things, being radically different in the past. And then the second sort of issue that makes the state sort of a problematic thing to study in archaeology is that it's difficult for us to sort of remove these ideas about social evolution that have been embedded in a lot of our models and frameworks and understandings about politics in the state. And social evolution is something that we talked about a little bit last class, if you remember. So if you remember, in that social evolutionary ladder, the state represents this like pinnacle of the development or civilizational achievement for human society. So it's sort of seen as this final end of a sequence of stages. That bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states sort of formula or trajectory is sort of the classic example of this. And so we have some, major questions surrounding the idea of the state that sort of emerges relatively early, I would say, in archaeology. And the first is how to actually define or identify a state, right? How do we know what we're looking at in the past? Is a state society or not? And then the second question is how does it develop, right? Where does it come from, this state? So when we start trying to define a state, the first thing we need to be very careful about doing is divorcing ourselves from the idea of the modern state, which is a particular form which is known as the nation state. And the idea of the nation state is a relatively modern entity when you're thinking about archaeological terms, because it's an idea that really develops in Western Europe between the 17th and 19th century. So it's something that sort of goes hand in hand with the early origins of anthropology and early imperialism and colonialism. It's sort of part of that larger package that we call modernity. And it's important to remember that these pre-modern states, or states prior to this, may have been organized differently. And the further back in time we go, the fewer historical records we're going to have that help us understand political organization. But once we get past that, we still have questions about how to understand the idea of the state. And part of that comes out in this Smith chapter, partially through his literature review, but specifically he has sort of this list of where this concept of the state comes from, and it's one of the many lists of four that he provides, I think, in explanation of certain concepts in this chapter. And actually that was something that helped me understand this chapter a little bit, is sort of go through those different lists of four and sort of write out what they were and what the points were. So basically one of the things he suggests that this idea of the state comes from four particular moments or sort of events. And the first is the depersonalization of the state in Europe, right? When you sort of have the decline of kings ruling by divine right, and the idea that the idea of political power, the ruler of a polity, is not invested in the person of a king. The second is this idea of the generalization of the state as a type of political form. And here with this and sort of some of the next sort of points, I think Smith is talking about the way political discussion emerges in literature, again, sort of around between the 17th and 19th century. So you get people talking about the idea of the state, and then furthermore you get what's called reification of the state, which is basically, reification is when you take an abstract concept and you talk about it like it's real. So he sort of talks about all this literature that sort of treats the state as if it is a real actual entity, which gets people in society thinking about it as if it's a real entity instead of an abstract concept. And then the last sort of issue is this issue of universalization, right? This idea that every society sort of gets organized along these lines, and this is this like sort of ultimate sort of form of social organization that everybody's going to come to. And so in doing all of this, he's basically pointing to the earliest literature that references ideas of the state. And again, as an archaeologist, it doesn't seem that early because we're sort of talking about the modern period. But this is often where you aim to start in a literature review. So basically, Adam Smith wants to talk about, the idea of the state in this literature review. So he basically goes back to the earliest sort of political literature that references the state. So he's going back to guys like Rousseau and even earlier than that to start sort of this review of the discussion, the scholarly discussion about this topic. So basically, a lot of people continue to debate the nature or sort of definition of the state, and there's a lot of, lot more references throughout this chapter, and sort of we have these different ideas about what a modern versus a pre-modern or archaic states are. And we have sort of this classic definition that comes to us from the sociologist Max Weber, which is when you have a centralized authority that has a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence or force. So certainly we can think about the use or threat of violence and how it's used to maintain a regime. But then we have questions as archaeologists about how to see this in the material record, right? Sometimes at certain sites and in certain structures, certainly you might see evidence for the restricted use of violence, but that could be something that's sort of a little bit difficult to interpret without a historical record or ethnographic record to tell us more direct information about what's going on and how power is organized. So, in trying to define states more materially as archaeologists, what we see by sort of the beginning of the 20th century are sort of these questions about how to define a state emerge as sort of this checklist of traits that's often associated with V. Gordon Childe, who is sort of a figure in our discussion about social evolution as well. And what's interesting about this checklist of traits is that it's in many ways based on these archetypical states that we see in Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica. So when we look at these case studies, we see everything from these checklists, and it sort of provides this sort of easy list of traits that you could look for in your case study and sort of try to identify whether you have a state level society. But I think it's important to remember, first of all, that we don't always have cases. We have cases that don't always fit this checklist. And then in that way, we can also question the analytical utility of this checklist in the sense that it sort of is used to define the state that we find in places like Mesoamerica and Mesopotamia, but at the same time, it's sort of drawn from the cases of what we see in Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica. So tautology is sort of a circular argument. We're sort of leading up to sort of the same point, basically, or a known point. So basically, you can ask whether it's really useful to have this kind of a checklist, but we do sometimes see this still crop up in various differently phrased sorts of ways. This idea that, to have a state level society, you would have, first of all, a certain size of population, and this could vary. Sometimes like a figure tossed around is between like 10,000, more than 10,000 people or more than 30,000 people, and you have a state level society in terms of a size. The idea that you have surplus production is an important one that sort of leads to a lot of the other traits that we associate with complex state level societies, and we can sort of talk about this in more detail. But the idea of surplus is extra, right? And this often relates to the idea of food production, whether people are either intensifying their hunting and gathering and foraging skills to the point where they have much more food that they can store over time or can be accumulated and sort of used for other purposes. More often than not, we sort of associate this sort of abundance or creation of a surplus with the advent of domestication in agriculture, and the idea that once people have more control over their animal and plant resources, their food, that they're then able to create a surplus, right? Fewer people are required to grow and manage all of the food that's required to feed a population. And the idea is from that you get sort of a number of other things because people are basically freed up. Labor is now available to do other things in society. So the idea of this surplus becomes incredibly important when we start talking about the development of social complexity in any form. And so from that we sort of see other things on this list. The idea of monumentality, that you would see large structures. And again, the idea is that some of this surplus energy or labor is now channeled into building, communal structures or larger structures. And not everybody has to be invested in food production. They can do things like build monuments. And the idea is that you would have people who have control over this surplus and are channeling this surplus energy or labor into certain directions like building monuments. That would be the establishment of a ruling elite. And then again, from that is the idea that people are doing different jobs in society now. They're not just focusing on the production or acquisition of food. So this is what we call specialization or craft specialization, right? The idea that different professions can now develop. And from that, you sort of start to see other things develop like sciences, art, trade. Writing is sort of an interesting one that sort of sometimes is seen as a fundamental characteristic or requirement of the state, and then sometimes is sort of seen as non-essential. And then urbanism, or the presence of cities or urban level settlements in your polity, is again sort of an interesting phenomena that's associated with states um, in sort of what I always call a chicken and egg sort of way, where we sometimes have questions about whether you can have a state without a city or a city without a state, and which one came first, but often they're sort of seen as entities that are closely associated with one another. So for a long time, this was sort of like this checklist that archaeologists would look for, and they would say, hey, do I have everything on this list? Okay, well then the society I'm looking at is a state. But as we kept on looking around at different case studies, and you kind of see here on this map on this slide, is sort of some of the classic archaic states, the sort of earliest states, that level societies that we see developing in the world. We start to see that there are cases that don't necessarily have every single thing from this checklist, right? There might be one that's missing writing, or one that's missing monumentality and evidence for a ruling elite. And we do have cases like this. So this sort of, again, brings to question the analytical utility of this sort of checklist. But basically what Adam Smith does, um, again in sort of his list, another list of 4 in this chapter, sort of goes through sort of some of the classic traits of what we call these archaic states, these early state level societies. So he talks about the idea of social stratification, right? That you have a class system or some sort of elite, and that these ruling elites, or these centralized bodies or institutions, are basically invested in preserving the uneven distribution of wealth. That basically they want the rich to stay rich and the people who are poor to stay poor. They're sort of trying to preserve that inequality in society. And furthermore, the idea is that these institutions are sort of maintaining that uneven distribution of wealth and that inequality by restricting resources and restricting access to resources, by controlling the economy, essentially. And that they're using force, or the threat of force, as a way of sort of getting people to agree with, or sort of accept the political order, to accept sort of the political status quo, essentially. So that in many ways mirrors some of those sort of more basic traits that are sort of created. And this is Smith's argument, that this is how states has sort of been envisioned in archaeological discourse in earlier periods of the discipline. So thinking about the ways that states have been defined and sort of characterized in previous literature, one of the things that comes to mind is that this idea of the state is associated with this idea of institutionalized inequality. Now, what does that mean? Basically, it means that the forms of social inequality we have in society, whether we're talking about class difference or racism or patriarchy and sort of gender discrimination, the idea is that it's ingrained in our society. It's sort of built into our codes of laws and our behaviors and our organizational sort of structures of society. And it's one of the reasons why these forms of inequality can persist, because it's sort of built into the way our society is organized and sort of lived in our everyday lives, basically. So the idea is that institutionalized inequality is sort of this fundamental characteristic of the state. And though we do see forms of hierarchy and status developing in earlier societies, and in some ways that social evolutionary scheme is sort of a scheme of increasing rank and increasing inequality in society, our sense is that from early times in most societies, some people would have more resources and more access to resources than other people. And we have different systems of status that would define who was more highly ranked. But by the time that we get to the idea of the state, I think the sense is that there are institutions or structures in society that are going to maintain existing systems of inequality. And I think I would certainly hope that we would all agree that this is something that we see in our own society, right? These systems of institutionalized inequality that are sort of ingraining forms of social inequality into our daily lives that make it very hard to eradicate. So the argument that Adam Smith is making here, and many other political anthropologists and archaeologists have argued the same, is that we need to abandon the idea of the state altogether and to think about politics using a different vocabulary and a different set of ideas. So these are sorts of themes that we're going to continue to see in our readings throughout this course. We're going to continue to see questions about definitions, right? And questions about what we're talking about when we talk about politics, and just sort of what the terms we should use are and what they mean. And then the second major sort of set of questions will revolve around questions about development, right? Questions about how these different forms of politics develop over time and what factors lead to their emergence at different points in time in different parts of the world. So here's where I would have hoped to have had some group discussion of the article. So there's a number of questions that I would have liked you guys to consider collectively, but I guess instead you will have to think about them on your own, and then I'm going to ask you to sort of put your responses to these questions on D2L. I'll create a section so that you can add those responses before our class on Thursday, and we can take a look at them. So I want you to think about sort of some of the different reasons Adam Smith gives for abandoning the state concept, right? Why does he think we need to stop talking about the state and start using other concepts and ideas to talk about politics as archaeologists? And the second question I'd like you to think about is sort of what he thinks we should put in its place, right? How should we think about politics instead? And then the third question is sort of more about what we need to pay attention to. And I guess particularly as an archaeologist, what we need to think about when we're sort of setting out to create a research program that investigates past politics. And this is sort of this question about what he phrases as what gaps between authority and landscape demand reproduction. And what what we mean by that is sort of what issues come up between sort of the imposition of somebody's will, right? The imposition of power over subjects, and sort of the lived reality of a place or a space, or this built landscape that's producing politics that continually needs some sort of work of politics. And in answering these three questions, I'll give you a clue that some of these answers are contained in those lists of 4 that I mentioned earlier that he has scattered throughout this article. So you may want to go back through those and identify what those are. And that was sort of, again, what I found helpful in understanding this article is sort of going through sort of what those list of 4s are addressing, and then sort of writing them out and trying to tease out sort of some meaning for that. So I'll ask you to think about these questions a little bit and then put up a response on D2L sometime, hopefully before class on Thursday, hopefully a little bit earlier, so I'll have time to go through them before class. And then for next class, I would like you to read this article. It's similarly a chapter out of a book, but it's not a book written by the authors. It's an edited volume written by a number of with chapters written by a number of different authors, written by Peter. But this particular introductory chapter is written by Peter Johansson and Andrew Bauer, called Reconfiguring the Political and the Reconstruction of Past Political Production. And in many ways, it's also a literature review, but like I said, it's slightly different nature than this one by Adam Smith. But as you read this one and sort of go through the worksheet for this particular reading, I want you to think about some of the similarities in vocabulary that you see, particularly with this Adam Smith article, and then even some of the other stuff we've read. And think a little bit about this idea of accumulating understanding. Another thing I'd like you to think about, and this is, I think, a good article to start with, is how to understand long, complicated sentences. And to think about whether some of the ideas expressed in this next reading could be phrased in simpler language with everyday vocabulary. And then think a little bit about what the utility of using complicated language in scholarly literature might be, because sometimes it can be useful or sort of used for a particular purpose, but sometimes it can also be a little bit off-putting and make it difficult to approach and understand an article. So think about those sorts of things for class on Thursday, and try to get your responses to these 3 particular questions up on D2L sometime in the next day or so, and email me if you have any questions, and I will hopefully see you on Thursday.